Once you see how easy and delicious this is to make, I promise this is going to be something that goes on the menu, if not every day, probably every week, and that is a homemade dump cake. Now, you've probably seen dump cakes before that use a bunch of store-bought stuff, but this is an honest to goodness from scratch dump cake, including the cake mix that comes together in just minutes, but tastes like you spent all day working on it. So if you do not have any homemade pie filling, you absolutely can use store-bought pie filling. You can, any of the flavors, I tell you what, they all turn out great and taste phenomenal. I've got apple pie filling here, blackberry, cherry, I have strawberry rhubarb that I realized I didn't pull down to show you. But today we're gonna make this with our apple pie filling. And if you wanna learn how to make and can your own homemade pie filling, all of my canning and preserving recipes are in Everything Worth Preserving. So if you don't have a copy of that, snag it. We'll put a link in the video description below. And then you too will have a plethora of homemade pie fillings to choose from to make this delicious dessert all year long. So very simple. I'm using a 10-inch cast iron skillet. You can use a pie plate. You can use a 10 by 13 baking dish, totally up to you. I just happen to think everything looks and tastes better in a mason jar and or a cast iron skillet. So we're just gonna pop the seal here. You can see there is our lovely apple pie filling. So this just gets dumped straight into the bottom of your baking dish. And you can see it's nice and thick, which means I need to grab the spatula in order to get this bad boy all the way out. So you can see no runny pie filling. Now, if you're using store-bought pie filling, then those jars or cans, you know, honest to goodness, it's been so long since I've bought any store-bought pie filling. I think they're about 21 ounces, whereas the quart here is 32 ounces. So if you're doing this in a cast iron skillet, I just use a single quart of homemade pie filling. But if you're using store-bought pie filling, you may want to double up and get 2 jars so that you've got a nice fruity base for the bottom of your dump cake. So dump cake it's similar to cobbler, but honestly, I think it tastes better than cobbler. And really it's kind of the only, I don't even make cobbler. We just always do dump cakes. So you literally are just dumping in, and then I'm just kind of smoothing this out so it's even, and we've got fruit in every bite. And then we're going to take our homemade cake mix. So we've got that cake mix in a jar. If you don't have this, one, you can check out the blog post that we'll link to beneath this video so that you can make this yourself. You could use a store-bought cake mix. I prefer homemade, obviously. So this, we are going to sprinkle evenly the entire dry cake mix on top of our pie filling here. All right, there we go. Now, one of the keys to making a successful dump cake is, for the love, do not stir. I know it goes against everything that you're used to when you're baking cakes or you're doing any type of baking to not stir, but if you stir it, it's not going to bake right. It's not going to have that wonderful, gooey, sweet fruit filling underneath, and then you get the buttery, crunchy topping on top. Like, it will not turn out, so just resist the urge. Trust the process. So now that we have our cake mix on there, the last thing that we do is we are going to be adding our butter. And actually I fibbed, because you could just totally do it like this, using your cake mix on top, adding the butter and then baking it. However, we always like things to have a little bit more flavor when we're doing homemade, or at least I do. So I am going to sprinkle just a little bit of cinnamon on the top here. So I'm basically just your apple pie spice type fillings. My favorite, I detest, loathe, abhor the flavor of cloves. So you will never find that I use cloves in any of my recipes. So I like to always use either, if I'm doing pumpkin spice, which you can do this with a pumpkin pie filling, it's delicious as well. I like to use some cinnamon, Ceylon cinnamon to be exact. And then I like to use just a pinch of ginger. Just gonna put a little bit of ginger on there. And I'm just kind of doing this just to taste and just visual flavor. And then I love nutmeg. Nutmeg is one of my favorite flavors. So I've got a whole nutmeg here, and this is just a zester. And so we are just going to zest on the top here some freshly grated nutmeg. And I tell you what, if you are just used to buying whatever like the spices are at the grocery store, oh my gosh, if you get a good high quality spice, you are going to be amazed at the difference in the flavor that it makes to your baked goods and your cooking. Okay, so I don't want to overpower this too much. So we're just going to go there with our nutmeg. Now we're going to add our very last ingredient, and that is our butter. So if you need to be dairy free, you could totally use coconut oil. I happen to love the flavor and the texture oh, that smells so good. Sorry, the smell of the nutmeg just hit me. Smells delicious. So you'll see dump cakes, which are also sometimes called wacky cakes. They have some different names, but a dump cake is just really the most accurate description in my opinion. So we are just going to take our butter here, and I have got a stick and a half of butter because in my opinion, butter makes everything taste better too. Now you could melt this and just pour it on, but whenever I make dump cakes, I don't ever melt my butter ahead of time. I'm like, that is just one more dish to dirty up and one more extra step. So instead, I just slice this into pats of butter. And what we want to do is just cover the surface, because once this hits the oven, all of these pats of butter are going to melt in with the flour and create this delicious buttery crust topping that's crunchy and oh so good, and then it's soft and tender underneath. So we're just going to put butter and dot that all over the entire top of our dump cake. So the butter is actually easier when you're cutting it if you have it slightly chilled. In true confession, I did not have any butter. I had to take it out of the freezer, and so I was trying to thaw it in a hurry and put it next to the wood stove, and it got a little soft. It's easier if it's chilled in the fridge in order to slice that and to get it on. But once you have it dotted with all of your pats of butter, then we're gonna go ahead and put that in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for approximately 50 minutes. So one of the things you want to do is, after this has been in there long enough for the butter to melt, but before it's really started to get crispy on the top, is you want to pull it out, and anywhere you see these areas that are still dry and powdery cake mix, that is where you want to add some additional pats of butter. And I've kind of tried every which way of doing different patterns of putting my pats and butter on, and I just kind of found that there's always going to be a few areas that inevitably don't get as it melts. And so I've just found it easier to put it in and then just come back through where needed, partway through the baking process. All right, and back in we go. Okay guys, and 50 minutes later, look at that. Oh, I'm just gonna inhale the goodness. So we're gonna let this cool slightly, and then one of the beautiful things about this is there's fruit involved and there's butter. So it can be dessert, it can be breakfast, it may end up being lunch today, but it is extremely delicious all on its own. But a dollop of whipped cream on top or a scoop of vanilla ice cream is also really good. And the great thing is it's hardly any work at all to get this ready to go. 50-minute bake time, and you have a bunch of deliciousness. So you can see we've got our big fruit slices, and then here, I don't know if the camera will pick it up, but you've got that crunchy part that's on the top. And of course, a little bit of whipped cream makes everything better. is really good. Because you get that crunchy layer right on the top where the butter had just melted the cake mix. And then you get like the soft, buttery, like ooey gooey part, but it's not like raw doughy. And then you hit the fruit. It's really good. I definitely say breakfast approved.